Hello, everybody. My name is Alexey Krabarov. I'm the AI community architect at Neo4j, the graph database company, and GenAI knowledge graph company. And here we are on location at Data Days, Texas. And we are interviewing amazing speakers for our FICA AI series, which is basically people in AI. So welcome Andrew Wen. Andrew is the head of data and AI at Best Buy Healthcare, and I just learned that Best Buy has healthcare. So tell us a little bit about what you do and what kind of problems you see in the field that require the use of AI.
Yeah, so I lead data and AI there. So that really encompasses everything from reporting, business intelligence, kind of your typical descriptive stuff, all the way to my AI ML teams. And we essentially at the core of it are enabling care at home. And what that means is running virtual hospitals, turning your bedroom into a hospital room in a sense, and helping with decentralized clinical trials, basically moving care outside of the brick and mortar of the hospital. And in that sense, we work with a lot of hospitals, health systems, pharma companies, and we're trying to navigate that complexity of patient data, data generated during care delivery, and how we can bring value and ultimately help improve human life.
And you said before, when we talked about it, that you basically focus on context engineering, and the context is a problem. Can you talk a little bit about it? What is context engineering, and why is it a problem, and how can we solve it?
Yeah, so it's basically introducing this idea of context engineering as a systematic approach to how do we capture, preserve, manage, but then ultimately integrate business context into our data pipelines and our data science workflows, and how do we ultimately extract insights. I think a big challenge today is that we do this already, but it's implicit. It's hidden away. We do it inside data wrangling pipelines. It's where we spend most of our time, right? We always hear that 80% of a data scientist workflow is in cleaning, processing, prepping data. What they're really doing there in many cases is managing the context without thinking of it that way. Now, by making it more explicit and really leaning into it, we can slowly work upstream where we're capturing that context earlier on. And so examples that I use in healthcare a lot, and one of the ones that I talked about earlier today, is as a physician, as a nurse, I enter data into the electronic health record.
Right.
And as a data scientist, we come along and we look at that data and we're just like, okay, well, here it says the patient's on whatever medication. This was their vital signs. This is what somebody observed. Well, what we don't know is that was actually put in by a nurse or a physician, and they're looking at that patient through different lenses.
Right.
And that context is key to how we analyze the data, even if we don't realize it.
Right. You know, I have a story about this. So I came to the US in 1993 to Dartmouth, and Dartmouth has Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center, which was one of the biggest healthcare centers. You know, I think the Surgeon General of the US was its director at the time. And then I worked with my computer science professors who collaborated. And then like many years ago, I moved and I found a piece of paper from this first meeting, 1993. Here's the top problems with American healthcare system. Number 1, electronic patient record. Number 2, incompatible healthcare IT systems. So 30 years later, why this problem is still here? And if we cannot even get data into basic format, interchangeable, how can we create context for this? Like, what do you think can kind of break through this wall of, mass incompatibility which healthcare is?
And that's a great question. And I think a lot of times people think like, if we can't even get through some of these basics, how do we deal with something like context? But at the same time, I want to flip that a little bit and say that part of the problem and why it's been so hard is because we haven't been looking at context explicitly.
Right.
And so if you look at where the healthcare industry's gone from, even in the last 10, 20 years, is we started to develop better standards of how do we ship data around, right?
Yes.
So the syntactic underpinnings of how we transmit data and how we interact from an interoperability standpoint.
Yes.
The problem is, even though we have that laid out, we have JSON, we have YAML, right? We have different formats to capture this. We even agree on what the schemas are. The problem is, even though we have that schema written down, I interpret it slightly differently in my hospital.
Yes.
You might interpret it different in your hospital. Dartmouth, Stanford, UCSF, they're all going to do it slightly differently. And so what we end up seeing is we build AI ML tools, whatever kind of fancy analytics that we're talking about today. We build it for one hospital, it works really well. And we typically see a startup spin out as a result, or a company acquires that algorithm somehow. Then we try to replicate that in other areas. And this is where things fall apart, because when we go from one hospital to another, the context of the data changed, even though on the surface it looks the same.
Yes.
And because we're not thinking about context explicitly, the model doesn't work as well. So then we think, is it a generalizability problem? Is there something else going on, right? And then in healthcare, one of the big things that we really lean into a bit is explainability, right? And kind of the responsible AI bits, where do we really know why a model is making the predictions that it did or the output that it did? And if we don't understand that context, even if we can trace through the model, we don't necessarily connect that dot back to what's the underlying data quality problem. And so I think if we, the technology exists today, but if we think about context a certain way and we use, and I'm a big fan of graph, for example. So if we use graphs and we're able to stitch things together, we're able to make explicit that functional context and we can manage it differently. And I think it's a mindset and paradigm shift on how we leverage our existing tools today that will really unlock this value.
Interesting. No, this is, this sounds, by the way, very relevant to recent developments because, Anthropic recently unveiled the Model Context Provider, MCP, right? And the idea is that very similar things to technology, because when you need to interchange data from different data sources, right, you need to define what the context is. So they actually define it specifically for data is coming from a graph. It will be different than data is coming from a SQL database. So it's very interesting to me that your conversion as practitioner on the kind of field need for this, which technologists are bringing from the tech stack. But to me, and so another area is called OpenCTX, which is my friend at SourceGraph are doing this context even more specific for developer tools. So when you are in your IDE doing code, and and so they basically want the code completion to be standardized because Copilot and Cursor and Cody, right? They basically have to have the same access. So the idea of context emerges there in technology, but you have this context in the field, and you talk about culture. So how do you, it's easy for them because they have already everything in the database. But now you're talking about humans, a nurse cards in the Epic PC, right? And instead of talking to you, they spend the whole visit typing, glance at you, right? And you have no idea what are they typing in there. Is will be so how do you capture this? I replacing this by audio. How do you envision building more context for the healthcare?
And I think that's what's so exciting right now is because this problem is not new, right? As long as we've been working with data in healthcare, we've had this problem.
Right.
But why are we talking about it now? And what's the opportunity that I see now? So we have multimodal models coming out, right? We're able to take in your voice in addition to the text itself, right?
Yes.
So how are you speaking about it? Are you questioning? Are you confused?
Yes.
Are you excited, happy, whatever it might be? So that's an element.
Yes.
But I think for us, really what it comes down to is, early today, Ol had that talk about metagrid, right? And it's kind of a paradigm shift in how we think about metadata.
Yes.
So I think what really it comes down to now is, are we then able to think about context and then from an engineering standpoint, building in the right touch points where we can actually extract that? So one example that I talked about earlier today is using something like LinkML, right? It allows you to define a data model, but then it generates your Python classes, it generates your protobuf schemas, a bunch of, there's a lot of generators downstream. What that does though is, as an engineering team, I can now think of data modeling instead of just we need to move data from A to B, let's do whatever we need with protobuf or whatever else. Now we have an artifact that we can manage. We can connect that artifact within our data catalogs and other areas to how we're going to use that data later, who else is generating that data, right? And so that's where we start to manage that context. And I think now there's a convergence of technology and mindset. And then with the whole shift in AI, I think it's absolutely critical because while we can use AI to help us manage context better, the other key thing is an AI is coming very literally into whatever data you give it. So we have to give it data with the right context. And one of the first sort of things that we saw when large language models first got popped out, especially from a general purpose, a general audience standpoint, is instead of just asking a large language model something, you specify first, I want you to play the persona of blank, right? To me, that is an example of making context explicit. So it's that mindset and that ability for us to then really focus in on that.
Well, this is exciting. So what are your plans for context engineering in healthcare? At Best Buy, what do you think? Is it a community project which all healthcare providers should rally around? Is it something you're going to build at Best Buy? What are your plans for making it a reality?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think at Best Buy right now, if you see what we're doing, we're trying to really build in that upstream, right, to our engineering team so that we can start capturing that context. We're also building it to our downstream teams, data science, data analysts, right, or BI developers and whatnot, and try to stitch all this together as we really take that next iteration of our data governance framework. But for me personally, around this context engineering idea, I really want us to start talking about it as an industry. Now, obviously, we have very specific needs in healthcare. I think the value of context engineering in healthcare is very high compared to many industries where things are a little bit more homogeneous, right? So there's a lot of heterogeneity and variety in healthcare. And what I would love is for anybody who wants to talk about this, reach out, let's discuss it. But I think we need to start shifting this mindset. And if the mindset shifts, then we'll see the tools catch up to it, right? So
Yes.
right now we're cobbling together things like LinkML, DBT, right? TypeDB, Neo4j, graph databases and whatnot there. I really love using rule engines to codify our knowledge and how we interact. So that way it's not hidden away in our software. But over time, even though we're cobbling that together today, I think we have an opportunity to have really purpose-built tools on doing this more automated ways, right? And really extracting the value of the context.
That's also exciting. And I personally think this is a big problem. And I think this is a perfect open source problem, right? Like,
Yep,
I think a
absolutely.
lot of people should come together. You know, we work with a lot of community organizations as Neo4j, Linux Foundation, AI Alliance. So, you know, I invite you to bring this to the community and like you do today, and definitely, you know, happy to work with you to bring this forward because I think it's going to benefit everybody.
Let's do it.
All right.
Awesome. Thank
you
you.
very much.